In the middle of a diamond auction, a millionaire humiliated the waitress for the $10 silver ring on her hand. But her one cold reply sent a hush through the entire room and unlocked a secret that could bring his billion-dollar empire crashing down. That once mocked ring was a witness to a sin he had tried to bury for 10 years. Can you guess what the young woman said to the millionaire? Let us know your guess in the comments, and don't forget to watch until the end of the video to see if you were right, because this ending will leave you breathless in the final seconds. An hour ago, Lena Carter was just a waitress at the Metropole Hotel, quiet, anonymous, working to pay her father's hospital bills. An hour later, everyone knew who she was. Not by name, but by a single sentence that silenced the most expensive room in New York. Everything changed in the span of 1 hour. The Aurora Crown Diamond Auction, hosted by Hale Capital, began at 8 o'clock in the evening. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, illuminating polished leather shoes and evening gowns worth a year's rent. This was a place where the rich came not to buy, but to be seen buying. Lena stood backstage, adjusting her white gloves. She was part of the temporary serving staff hired for the event. Her task was simple: carry the tray bearing the diamond onto the stage when the MC signaled. Every step had to be precise, in rhythm, perfectly angled under the lights. She had practiced twice, hoping only for the night to pass peacefully. But life is never as peaceful as one hopes. The alarm suddenly blared, a piercing, deafening sound in the luxurious atmosphere. The chandeliers flickered 3 times, then went out. The entire hall was plunged into darkness. There were screams, the sound of falling glasses, and the clatter of high heels on the stone floor. Red emergency lights switched on, bathing everything in a ghostly glow. A titanium cage descended around the empty display pedestal. The Aurora Crown diamond had not yet been brought out, but the security system had automatically locked down. Adrian Hale, chairman of the corporation and host of the event, shot up from his seat. At 38, he was a man every financial magazine called the epitome of absolute control. But his voice now rang out, filled with fury. "Somebody explain to me what the hell is going on?" The event manager was frantic. "A false alarm, sir." "Probably a system error, but the backup generator isn't starting." "Then turn it on manually," Adrian snapped. "We can't. It's fully automated. 10 minutes in the dark, surrounded by hundreds of VIP guests. If just one person panicked, the media would turn it into a catastrophe." Adrian felt his heart pound, anger rising in his throat. He never accepted a loss of control. Then, a calm voice spoke from behind the manager. "The emergency breaker is in the back of the storage room, sir. It's an old system. You have to flip it by hand." Everyone turned. It was the young waitress, Lena. She wasn't trembling, wasn't flustered. She spoke as if she were reading a technical note. Adrian frowned. "Are you sure?" "I saw the electrical diagram when I went into the storeroom to get tablecloths. The breaker box is inside. There were no other options." "Lead the way," Adrian said, his tone clipped. The two of them walked through the dark service corridor, lit only by the flashing red lights. The faint smell of an electrical fire hung in the air. Lena walked ahead, her step steady, without hesitation. She stopped in front of an old metal box, unlatched it, and then, with all her strength, pushed the rusty lever upward. Clack. The dry sound of the power restarting echoed. The entire ballroom lit up again. A wave of relieved sighs spread through the crowd. People applauded, laughed, as if they had just survived a moment of chaos. Lena stood still, her hand still on the lever. A sheen of sweat was on her forehead, but her eyes were calm. Adrian looked at her for a second, an unreadable glance that could have been curiosity, admiration, or merely a quick assessment. He didn't say thank you. He just turned to his manager and ordered, "Get everything back in order." "We restart in 5 minutes. He walked away without a backward glance. The auction restarted as if the incident had never happened. People resumed their talk of diamonds, value, and power. Lena returned to her post, her hands still trembling slightly. She didn't need anyone to know she was the one who had saved the party. All she needed was to finish her shift and go to her father at the hospital. That was enough, but fate wasn't done with her yet. The MC signaled. It was her turn to pull back the velvet curtain and reveal the diamond. Lena stepped onto the stage. This time, the spotlight was directly on her, a small young woman in a gilded space. She placed her hand on the edge of the fabric, and the cameras zoomed in for a close-up. The silver ring on her finger caught the light, reflecting a faint gleam. A laugh erupted from the front row. "My God, do even the servers have to wear fakes?" The remark was enough to make the whole room chuckle. A woman in a sequined dress leaned toward the VIP table and added, "I guess the staff's salary isn't enough to buy anything real, even if they know how to fix the electricity." Lena heard every word. She didn't look up, but her hand tightened on the edge of the fabric. Adrian stepped onto the stage. She saw his shadow from the corner of her eye and felt a fleeting sense of relief. Maybe this time he would say something, at least to stop them. He had seen her work. He'd seen her save the entire event. But he only smiled, his voice smooth but cold as steel. "It's quite all right. At least she helps us remember that some hands are only meant to touch cheap metal." The laughter rang out again, louder, crueler. Lena felt something inside her chest break. It wasn't anger, but a sudden, sharp clarity. She understood. To people like them, competence could never overcome class. She didn't respond right away. The silence stretched just long enough for everyone to realize they were waiting for her reaction. Lena lifted her head, her gaze steady, her voice soft and clear. Sometimes cheap metal can withstand a fire that gold cannot. The sentence cut through the air like a thin, sharp, cold blade. No one laughed anymore. Adrian stood frozen. The polite smile on his lips hardened. She pulled back the velvet curtain, revealing the Aurora Crown diamond, sparkling emotionlessly under the lights. Then she stepped back and quietly exited the stage, her back perfectly straight. Her departure left the millionaire with much to think about. What could possibly happen next that would bring him to tears? The Rolls-Royce was still waiting, its engine purring as quietly as a resting predator. Adrian Hale was about to tell the driver to go, but he paused. He had just seen her, Lena Carter, stepping out of the employee entrance. She walked toward a hidden corner of the service alley, where giant dumpsters and the smell of dampness replaced the glamour of the main hall. She pulled out her phone. Adrian did something he rarely did. He grew curious. He signaled for the driver to cut the engine and lower the window just enough for the sounds of the night to creep in. "Adrian, what are you waiting for?" Victor Langford, his strategic partner, had just approached, adjusting his silk tie. Adrian raised a finger, signaling for silence. Through the patter of the rain, a worried, tired voice drifted from the alley. "No, I'm fine. I'm okay." Lena's voice trembled slightly. "I'll figure out the hospital bills, Dad. Don't worry." "Yes. I'll call you back later." She hung up and stood still in the darkness for a moment, her shoulders shaking faintly before she turned and walked away. Adrian silently raised the window. That brief, private moment, one he had no right to witness, felt more real than the multi-million-dollar auction that had just concluded. Victor got into the car, bringing with him the scent of cognac and self-satisfaction. The door closed, completely cutting off the outside world. The interior was silent, filled only with the smell of leather and fine wood. Victor poured himself a glass of liquor from the car's minibar. He took a sip, then burst out laughing. "You're better at putting people down than I thought, Hale. One sentence, and you shut down the whole stage." Adrian didn't reply. He stared out the window, where the city lights blurred into streaks of color behind the rain. Victor's compliment, combined with the phone call he had just overheard, made him feel strangely uncomfortable. It was like a sharp pebble inside his perfect leather shoe. "What is it?" Victor sneered, noticing Adrian's silence. "Don't tell me you're bothered by a waitress." "Listen, the world runs on a simple rule. Money buys loyalty, it buys silence, and it certainly buys forgiveness. Don't worry about it." The phrase "money buys loyalty" was usually Adrian's guiding principle, but tonight it sounded hollow. It grated on him. The car stopped in front of the Hale estate. Inside, his father, Marcus Hale, was waiting in his study. He was an older man with silver hair and eyes that still held the sharpness of an old wolf. "I've reviewed the terms of the charity fund," Marcus said directly, without a word of greeting. "Victor is controlling it, bit by bit. He's turning our PR tool into his own money laundering machine." Adrian took off his coat and placed it on a chair. "That's the price for a $2 billion contract, Father." "We need Victor," he replied, his voice tinged with exhaustion. He didn't want another confrontation tonight. Marcus looked at his son and shook his head. "You trust him too much. Some prices are too high to pay." Meanwhile, Lena was on the last bus of the night. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed. The smell of damp coats and exhaust fumes mingled in the air. Her phone vibrated. It was a text from the manager at the Metropole. "Lena, your temporary contract will not be renewed. Thank you for your work. Your pay will be transferred tomorrow. No explanation." But she knew why. Negatively impacting the brand's image. She turned off the screen and put the phone in her pocket. It wasn't a surprise. That was how their world worked. People like her were just faceless pawns, easily swept off the board at any time. When she got back to her small but clean rented room, the first thing Lena did was go to her old wooden desk. On it, in a simple frame, was a picture of a woman with a gentle smile and eyes exactly like hers. Her mother. She sat down and took off the silver ring. Under the yellow light of the desk lamp, she carefully cleaned the day's grime from it with a soft cloth. She wiped every part of it, as if she were caring for a treasure. "I'm still wearing it, Mom," she whispered to the photograph, "no matter how much they laugh." That night, in the lavish mansion and the tiny rented room, two people from completely different worlds couldn't sleep. Adrian tossed and turned, troubled by a question of value he had never had to ask himself, while Lena faced the harsh reality of bills and an uncertain future. Neither of them knew that their brief moment at the auction had bound their fates together with an invisible thread, taut and full of complications. All night, Adrian couldn't get the image of the young woman and his father's words out of his head. Some prices are too high to pay. Unease was a foreign and unpleasant feeling for him. To regain control, the next morning he decided to do something unscheduled. Personally visit the Hale Legacy construction site. He needed to be surrounded by the language he understood best: concrete, steel, and logical blueprints. The atmosphere at the construction site was a world away from the Metropole Hotel. It was thick with the smell of cement dust, sweat, and the constant roar of machinery. The July sun beat down like a furnace, turning the massive steel frames into giant grills. Adrian unbuttoned his suit jacket, feeling the discomfort of reality. This was his world, a world built on tangible numbers. At lunchtime, the machinery fell silent. Workers sought out the rare patches of shade to rest. Adrian was walking with a few project managers when he noticed a small truck parked near the trailers. A young woman was handing out cold bottles of water from a large ice chest. She wore a faded baseball cap, her face dotted with sweat. Adrian squinted. Despite the baggy work clothes, he recognized her. Lena Carter. He stopped in his tracks. The foreman, an older man with sun-beaten skin and calloused hands, saw Adrian's gaze and walked over, his voice slightly surprised. "Mr. Hale, you noticed that girl too. She's with the water supply company, but she's a hard worker." Adrian didn't turn, his eyes still on Lena. "I've met her before," he said non-committally. The foreman nodded, his tone tinged with a sadness, as if talking about family. "She's a Carter. Poor girl. Her father, Henry, used to be one of Hale Construction's best engineers, a brilliant, dedicated man. But a few years ago, there was an accident at the Green Havens site. He's paralyzed now. I heard the girl was a top engineering student at the time, had to drop out to support the family." An icy chill ran down Adrian's spine. Green Haven. The name was a scar on the corporation's history, a partial collapse, a costly and humiliating scandal. He remembered the company had placed the blame entirely on some engineer to close the case, Henry Carter. He nodded at the foreman, a mechanical gesture to hide his inner shock. "Thank you for the information." He turned and walked away, not letting Lena see him. The scattered pieces began to spin wildly in his head. An engineering student forced to drop out, a father injured at the Green Haven site, a family with the last name Carter. It all pointed to one place, Hale Construction. On the way back, Adrian's tablet was flooded with notifications. Partners and auction attendees sent emails praising the event. A few even included links to entertainment articles, calling his remark the wittiest and classiest moment of the night. Victor Langford sent a text. "See? Now the whole city knows who's king." Normally, such flattery would have pleased him, but today it felt empty and fake. He scrolled past them, then stopped at a video clip posted by a guest. The clip showed that exact moment, when the camera zoomed in on her hand. Compelled by something he couldn't explain, he paused the video and used 2 fingers to zoom in on the image. The video quality of expensive phones was astonishing now. This time, he saw it clearly. On the tarnished surface of the silver ring, 2 letters and a number were etched simply, almost crudely. H.C. 2015. The silence in the luxury car suddenly became heavy. H.C. Henry Carter. 2015. The year of the Green Haven collapse. The coincidence was too great to ignore. It was no longer speculation. It was a screaming truth. That ring wasn't a piece of jewelry. It was a portable tombstone, a daily reminder of a tragedy. He picked up his phone and called his legal assistant, Sarah. His voice was cold and emotionless, the way it always was when he gave an important command. "Sarah." "Yes, Mr. Hale? I need you to do something, and it must be absolutely confidential. Access Hale Construction's old archives. Find all documents related to the Green Haven construction accident in 2015. He paused for a moment to emphasize the importance. Specifically, the personnel file, safety reports, and termination notice for an engineer named Henry Carter. The line was silent for a second. Sarah knew the Green Haven incident was a forbidden topic. "I understand, sir. I'll send you the report as soon as I can." He hung up and leaned back in his seat. The city sparkled outside the window, but he no longer saw its beauty. He only felt a creeping unease, a sense that he was about to unearth a truth that his father and the entire corporation had tried to bury long ago. He had stood on a stage in front of hundreds of people and mocked the symbol of a pain that his own family might have caused. The wait for Sarah's report made Adrian restless. He sat in his office, flipping through multi-million-dollar contracts without actually reading a word. His mind kept replaying the foreman's tragic story, an engineer who rushed into the rubble to save his wife. Just then, the office door swung open. Victor Langford walked in unannounced, a predator's smile on his face. "Adrian, my friend," Victor said, placing a thick, leather-bound portfolio on Adrian's desk. "Just one signature from you, and the $2 billion charity fund will officially be active." Adrian didn't look at the portfolio. He was looking at Victor's face, trying to find a crack, some sign related to the past. Victor laughed and sat down in the chair opposite him. "Come on, still worried about that waitress? I told you don't waste your time. Focus on what's real." He leaned forward, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Money is what buys trust, Adrian. And silence. Silence." The word now carried a terrifying weight. Just as Victor pushed a gold-plated fountain pen toward Adrian, the internal phone on his desk rang. He glanced at it. The screen displayed the name, Sarah Jenkins, Legal Department. "Excuse me for a moment," Adrian said, and answered the phone. "Mr. Hale," Sarah's voice came through, slightly rushed. "I've found the initial file. Henry Carter, structural engineer. Fired after the Green Haven incident, assigned full responsibility. His wife, Eleanor Carter, is listed as one of the fatalities in the collapse. Their daughter is Lena Carter, currently working the night shift at the Daily Grind coffee shop." Adrian's chest felt like it had been hit by an invisible fist. The foreman's story was true. He kept his expression perfectly neutral. "Thank you, Sarah." "Keep digging," he said, and hung up. He looked up, meeting Victor's eyes directly. "I need more time for my lawyers to review this." He pushed the portfolio and the pen back toward Victor. Victor's smile vanished. "Time? Adrian, we had an agreement." "I said I need more time," Adrian repeated, his voice now as cold as steel. Victor stared at Adrian for a long moment, trying to figure out the reason for this sudden change. Finally, he stood up, clutching the portfolio. "Fine. The end of the week. But don't keep me waiting long." When Victor left, Adrian stood up and walked to the window. He couldn't just sit and wait for a report anymore. Those documents could have been altered. He needed the truth from the source. That evening, he drove to the Daily Grind. It was a small, cozy coffee shop, a complete contrast to his world. He saw Lena behind the counter, cleaning the espresso machine. She wore a simple apron, her hair tied up in a bun. When she looked up and saw him walk in, she froze for a second. Her eyes flashed with caution. Then she turned away, continuing her work as if he were thin air. He chose a table in a quiet corner and sat down. A moment later, another employee brought him a menu. Adrian waited patiently. He ordered a black coffee. As the shop emptied out, he saw Lena begin to clean tables in preparation for closing. He walked up to the counter where she was standing. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low and direct. Lena didn't even look up at him. "I have nothing to say to you," she replied, her voice cold, her hand still wiping the wooden counter. "Just 5 minutes. About your father, about Green Haven." At the mention of that name, her hand stopped. She looked up, and for the first time, Adrian looked directly into her eyes up close. There was no fear in them, only a solid wall of exhaustion and mistrust. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice even but sharp, "your world and my world have nothing in common. You made that clear at the auction. You had your fun, and that's enough. Now please leave. We're about to close." She finished speaking and turned her back, resuming her work, an unmistakable dismissal. Her blunt refusal surprised Adrian. He was used to people wanting to talk to him, wanting his attention. He didn't give up. "I didn't come for fun. I want to know the truth." Lena let out a short, mirthless laugh. "The truth? The truth is that your company destroyed my family and you mocked our pain in front of hundreds of people. What other truth could you possibly want to know? I want to know about the warnings that were ignored, Adrian said, his voice lowering. I want to know who signed the final order. Lena stopped her work completely. She turned back, staring at him. A flicker of pain crossed her eyes before it was masked by hardness. Why should I tell you? She shot back. So you can find a way to bury it deeper. Or so you can pay me some money and call it justice. I don't need your money. I don't need your pity. And I certainly don't need you interfering in my life ever again. She pointed to the door. Please leave. Adrian stood still for a long moment before that unbreachable wall. He realized he couldn't use power or money to get the answer. He had broken her trust before it could even form. He had slammed shut the only door that led to the truth. He nodded, a gesture acknowledging his defeat. I understand. He turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving Lena alone in the dim, yellow light. He had failed, but her refusal, the resilience in her eyes, only strengthened his resolve. If she wouldn't talk, he would find out himself. He would turn the entire corporation upside down to find that signature. Adrian left the coffee shop, but Lena's rejection didn't extinguish his determination. On the contrary, it ignited a different fire. The wall she had built wasn't made of baseless hatred. It was constructed from real pain and deep mistrust. He realized he couldn't get the truth with words. He had to dig it up himself from the very foundations of the Hale Empire. He didn't go home. He drove straight to the Hale Construction headquarters, an older, less glamorous building than the Hale Capitol Tower. It was well past midnight, and the building was nearly empty. He used his CEO access to get past security, his footsteps echoing in the silent hallway. His destination was the basement, the data archives. The heavy steel door opened to reveal a cold room filled with rows of shelves holding paper files and humming server racks. The night guard was Mr. Gable, an archivist who had worked for the Hales since before Adrian was born. "Young Mr. Adrian," Mr. Gable said in surprise, pushing his glasses up. "What brings you down here at this hour?" "I need to access the files for an old project, Mr. Gable." "Green Haven, 2015. Adrian said directly, without explanation. Mr. Gable looked momentarily flustered. "That project. The files were digitized and sealed under Chairman Marcus's order. But if it's your order, it's my order." Mr. Gable led Adrian to an old computer terminal. Projects from that era were mostly scanned and saved on the internal server, sir. Everything should be here. Adrian sat down. He typed Green Haven 2015 into the search bar. Hundreds of files appeared. He opened the safety reports folder. The documents were perfectly organized. He found Henry Carter's report. It was suspiciously brief, just a few lines describing standard procedures. The conclusion stated clearly, Engineer Henry Carter failed to follow reporting protocols, leading to construction errors. Everything was too clean, too perfectly designed to blame one person. "This has been edited," Adrian muttered. His gut told him so. "Mr. Gable, are there any other backups? A backup drive, a spare hard drive, anything from before the system was cleaned up?" Mr. Gable hesitated for a long moment, then nodded. "There is an offline backup drive. We used it to save drafts and original documents before they were officially approved. It was an old policy. Not sure if it still works." They found it in a locked cabinet. After a few minutes of connecting it, a simple interface appeared. Adrian repeated the search. This time, he found a different file. Its name had an extra suffix, _V1_original. He opened it. It was a completely different report, over 20 pages long, filled with complex calculations, simulations of stress fractures, and underlined passages warning of substandard steel structures and risk of collapse under high load. The author, Henry Carter, had requested an immediate halt to construction. Adrian scrolled to the last page. There, he saw a scanned handwritten note. It crossed out the entire warning section and replaced it with a short directive. Remove unnecessary sections. Retain report in standard format. And beneath that directive was a signature he had seen his entire life. M. Hale. Marcus Hale. His father. An icy chill shot down Adrian's spine. His father didn't just know, he was the one who had ordered the truth to be hidden. He was about to close the file, but then something caught his eye. There was another page attached after the original report, something not included in the official version. It was an internal memo. Subject: Approval of additional costs, Greenhaven project. Content: Approval of a supplementary payment to the subcontractor V Logistics for material replacement and schedule acceleration. The amount was 7 figures. Adrian frowned. V Logistics. That was one of Victor Langford's subsidiary companies. And then he saw the signature approving the expenditure. It wasn't his father's. It was Victor Langford's, in his capacity as project supervising partner. The memo was signed just 2 days after his father had signed the order to erase Henry Carter's warnings. His father had covered up a technical failure, but Victor Langford had used money to turn that failure into a deliberate crime. He had paid to use cheaper, lower-quality materials, and his father had been complicit by silencing the only engineer who dared to speak up. They were a criminal alliance. Adrian copied all the files onto an encrypted USB drive. He returned to the mansion as dawn was breaking. Marcus Hale was already awake, reading the newspaper in his study. Adrian didn't say a word. He placed the tablet on the desk, displaying the 2 signatures side by side. One his father's, one Victor's. Marcus looked at the screen, then up at his son. His expression held no remorse, only the cold composure of a man accustomed to making ruthless decisions. "No one builds an empire with compassion, my son," he said. Adrian's whole world collapsed, but it didn't just collapse because of his father's deceit. It collapsed because he realized the man he was partnering with, the man he was about to entrust with $2 billion, was more dangerous and evil than he could have imagined. The foundation of Hale Capital wasn't just built on lies. It was built on blood, and Victor Langford was the one who had mixed the mortar. "No one builds an empire with compassion, my son." His father's words echoed in Adrian's head the entire drive away from the mansion. He didn't go to the office, didn't go to his club. He drove aimlessly through familiar streets, but for the first time he felt like a stranger in his own city. The Hale Capital Tower glittered proudly against the skyline, but now he saw it only as a giant tombstone built on silence and blood. He had confronted his father, not with anger, but with a cold question. "How much did Victor pay you to sign that order?" Marcus Hale had only remained silent, and that silence was the answer. Adrian realized he couldn't find the truth from the men who had buried it. He needed to go to the man who had been buried alive with it. He turned the steering wheel, and the car sped off in a completely different direction, toward a part of the city he had never set foot in. His destination, St. Mary's Hospital. The hospital room he entered was a stark contrast to his world. It was small, painted an off-white that had yellowed with age. There was no smell of fresh flowers, only the faint scent of antiseptic, the whirring of an old fan on the wall, and the tinny sound from a small TV were the only noises. Lena was there, her back to the door. She was carefully replacing an empty water pitcher on the bedside table. She wasn't in uniform, just a simple t-shirt and jeans. She looked smaller, more fragile. When she turned and saw Adrian, she froze. Her whole body tensed like a small animal cornered. Surprise quickly turned to anger and suspicion. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice hostile. She immediately positioned herself between Adrian and the hospital bed. Adrian didn't look at her. His gaze was on the man lying in the bed. Henry Carter was thin and pale, but his eyes, though tired, still held a sharp, intelligent light. "I came," Adrian said, his voice low and weary, "to speak with the only person who dared to tell the truth when the whole world chose to be silent." That statement surprised both Lena and her father. With great effort, Henry propped himself up on his elbows, his back against the headboard. He looked Adrian up and down, an assessing gaze that held no fear. "You're Marcus Hale's son, aren't you?" His voice was weak, but every word was clear. "I thought people like you never set foot in public hospitals like this." Adrian stepped closer, but maintained a respectful distance. He did something he had probably never done in front of a stranger. He bowed his head. It wasn't a polite nod, but a gesture of genuine humility. "I'm not here as his son," Adrian said, looking up, his gaze direct. "I'm here to hear the story from the one who suffered, not from the victor." Henry looked at him for a long moment. Then a sad smile flickered across his gaunt face. "What do you want to hear?" "That I was right. That if they had listened to me, my wife wouldn't be dead and I wouldn't be lying here. Everyone knows that, including your father." He broke into a long coughing fit, and Lena rushed to pat his back. "I don't need an apology," Henry continued after catching his breath. "An apology won't give me back my legs, and it won't bring my wife back. But if you, Adrian Hale, still have a shred of conscience, then do what your father never did. Protect those weaker than yourself." The statement wasn't an accusation. It was a last will, a charge to keep. Adrian stood in silence, absorbing every word. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you, sir." As he turned to leave, Henry took his daughter's hand. Lena still watched Adrian with suspicion, but the hostility had lessened. "Don't hold on to hate, my daughter," Henry whispered, loud enough for Adrian to hear before he stepped out the door. "Hate doesn't bring justice. It only takes your heart." As Adrian reached the door, he glanced back. His and Lena's eyes met. The wall of conflict, of two opposing worlds, was still there, but this time a tiny, fragile ray of trust had just begun to shine through it. Adrian knew what he had to do. He wouldn't just reopen the case, he would destroy the alliance that caused it. Adrian left St. Mary's Hospital, but Henry Carter's words clung to him. "Do what your father never did. Protect those weaker than yourself." This was no longer an investigation to satisfy his curiosity. It was now a responsibility. The next day, he didn't return to the hospital right away. Instead, he sent a new tablet to Henry's room, one with an anti-glare screen, preloaded with access to the world's largest digital and technical journal libraries. It came with a simple note. "So an engineer never has to be bored." Lena saw the tablet. She was about to refuse it, but when she saw her father pick it up, his eyes lighting up with fascination as he scrolled through complex designs and formulas, she remained silent. It was the first time in years she had seen her father truly engrossed in something beyond the four walls of his hospital room. The wall of ice around her heart began to show more small cracks. Adrian didn't stop there. A few days later, he returned. He brought no gifts. He just came to visit. He sat and listened as Henry talked about bridges, about material strength, about ideas he never had the chance to implement. Adrian, with his businessman's mind, listened intently. He didn't just listen. He asked questions, debated, like two colleagues. Lena often stood in a corner of the room, observing quietly. She saw a different side of Adrian Hale. Not the cold CEO on the stage, nor the enemy who had destroyed her family. Here, in this small hospital room, he was just a man trying to connect. One evening, when he arrived, he noticed the fluorescent light in the hallway outside the room was flickering constantly, creating an irritating glare. A nurse walked by, sighing. "We've told management several times, but they're too busy." Without a word, Adrian found a chair, stood on it, removed the light fixture's cover, and started examining it. Lena stood in the doorway, watching him. The sight of a man in a $1,000 Armani suit, his sleeves rolled up, fumbling with old electrical wires, was bizarre, but also strangely warm. He fixed it, and the light stabilized. He dusted off his hands, turned, and met her gaze. For the first time, she didn't look at him with suspicion. They started talking more, usually brief conversations in the hospital corridor after her shift ended. "I thought I understood value," Adrian admitted during one such talk, his voice contemplative. "Money, power, legacy. But at the auction, you and your ring made me realize I understood nothing about dignity." Lena was quiet for a long moment, then replied softly, "Dignity isn't something people can give you or take away. It's the only thing you have left when you have nothing else." Between them, a fragile thread of empathy was slowly forming. It wasn't love yet, but it was woven from respect, understanding, and a shared sorrow, as Henry once told his daughter when they were alone. "Maybe not all Hales are the same, my dear." One late evening, after leaving the hospital, Adrian had just arrived back at the mansion. He felt a strange sense of peace he had never known. He believed he was on the right path, that he could fix the mistakes of the past. Just then, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. He answered. On the other end was a nurse's voice, panicked and rushed. "Is this Adrian Hale?" "A relative of the patient Henry Carter in room 402. Adrian's heart clenched. "Yes, this is he." "What's wrong?" "You need to get to the hospital right away. Mr. Carter is having trouble breathing. His condition has taken a turn for the worse." Adrian didn't remember how he drove to the hospital. He only remembered the blaring of horns, the blur of streetlights, and his chest tightening with a vague sense of dread. He bolted from the car, not bothering to lock it, and ran through the deserted main lobby straight to the 4th floor. When he reached the end of the hall, he saw Lena, her head buried against the door of room 402, her shoulders shaking violently. The door was ajar, and inside, doctors and nurses were moving urgently. Adrian walked over, his heart sinking into a bottomless pit. "Lena," he called softly. She looked up. Her face was soaked with tears, her eyes empty and frantic. Just then, an older doctor stepped out of the room, his expression grave. He looked at Lena, then at Adrian, and shook his head. "We're so sorry. We did everything we could. The patient didn't make it." Lena's world shattered. She staggered, and if Adrian hadn't caught her, she might have collapsed. He helped her to a nearby chair, feeling an overwhelming sense of helplessness. He had been too late. All hope of making amends, of bringing justice for Henry while he was still alive, had vanished into thin air. The doctor concluded the initial cause was acute cardiac shock due to complications from his underlying condition. It all seemed like an unavoidable tragedy. But because it was a sudden death, the hospital was required to follow procedure and notify the police. 2 police officers arrived. They spoke privately with the doctors and nurses. Adrian sat beside Lena, not knowing what to say. He could only be there, sharing the heavy silence. The fragile trust they had just built seemed to be tested by a tragedy too immense. A moment later, one of the officers approached them. He had a stern expression. "Miss Carter, we are very sorry for your loss. There are a few irregularities we need to clarify." Mr. Carter's medication chart appears to have been altered this afternoon. A high-dose sedative was added, which could have triggered a cardiac shock reaction in someone with his condition. Lena's head shot up, her eyes wide. Altered? Who would do that? The officer glanced at Adrian. We checked the security cameras. Mr. Hale, the cameras show you were at the hospital this afternoon, around 5 o'clock. He paused, flipping through his notebook, and a nursing trainee said she saw a man in a suit who looked a lot like you enter the patient's room last before her shift ended. Adrian was stunned. He had been at the hospital that afternoon. He had brought Henry some old books his father used to read, thinking he would enjoy them. He had only stayed a few minutes, talking with Henry before Lena arrived. Yes, I was here, Adrian admitted, trying to stay calm. But I didn't touch any medication. I just brought him some books. The officer's expression was unreadable. We're sorry, Mr. Hale, but since you were the last person seen near the patient, and there are suspicious points in the medical records, we need to ask you to come down to the station to help clarify a few things. The words hit Lena like a bolt of lightning. The pain of losing her father, combined with the news that he might have been murdered. And now, the prime suspect was the man she had just started to trust. It all coalesced into a furious rage. She shot to her feet, shoving Adrian away. Her eyes were filled with hatred and a sense of betrayal. "It was you!" she screamed, her voice breaking with pain. "Why did you come here? To pretend you cared, to gain our trust, and then silence my father forever, right?" "Lena, that's not—" Adrian reached for her, but she recoiled as if he were a venomous snake. "My father was about to tell the truth. You were afraid of that, weren't you? You and your father are both liars, murderers." "I didn't do it. I swear," Adrian said, his voice lost in a mix of shock and helplessness. "I was just trying to help him." But his words were drowned out by Lena's sobs and her hate-filled glare. The second officer stepped forward, gently but firmly placing himself between them. "Mr. Hale, please come with us." They led him away. Adrian only had time to look back at Lena one last time. He saw her collapsing to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The wall of ice between them hadn't just been rebuilt. This time it was fortified with blood and betrayal. The one person he wanted to protect now believed he had killed her father. The interrogation room was cold and impersonal, just like the feeling in Adrian's chest. He had recounted everything, from his visit with Henry and the books he brought to their brief conversation. But he knew that the words of a Hale, a suspect, carried little weight against the circumstantial evidence piling up against him. He was held for further investigation. Helplessness gnawed at him. He wasn't afraid of prison. He was afraid of the look in Lena's eyes as he was taken away. Meanwhile, Lena sat alone in the now empty hospital room. The pain and rage had given way to a numbing emptiness. She had been a fool to trust Adrian. Her father's warning, "Don't hold on to hate," now sounded like a mockery. Hate was the only thing she felt. Just then, Victor Langford appeared at the door. He wore a formal black suit, his face a perfect mask of sorrow. He carried a bouquet of white lilies. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice low and full of sympathy. "I just heard the news. My deepest condolences. Your father was a brave man." Lena didn't respond, just looked at him with lifeless eyes. Victor placed the flowers on the bedside table. He sighed, a carefully calculated sound. "It's such a shame," I warned Adrian. "I told him not to dig up the Greenhaven case. Some things are best left in the past. Perhaps someone wanted to keep that secret silenced forever." That sentence, uttered with a meaningful expression, was like a hammer driving the final nail into the coffin of Adrian's guilt. Someone wanted to keep that secret silenced forever. In Lena's mind, That someone could only be Adrian Hale, the man who pretended to be remorseful only to strike when she let her guard down. Her fragile trust had been cruelly exploited. Victor left, leaving Lena to drown in a sea of chaotic and bitter thoughts. 2 days later, after handling the initial arrangements, Lena returned to the hospital room to pack her father's few personal belongings. Each item was a knife to the heart: the old radio, the reading glasses, a few sets of clothes. Finally, she picked up the stack of books and the old notebook her father often used for his notes. As she flipped through the notebook, a piece of paper, folded in 4, fell out. It was an unsent letter, her father's handwriting shakier than usual, as if he had written it with the last of his strength. To my dearest daughter, if you are reading this, I may not have much time left. I've had a bad feeling these last few days, but I'm not writing this letter to say goodbye, but to tell you something important. If a man named Adrian Hale comes to find you after I'm gone, and if something happens to me, trust him. Don't believe what you see or what others say. I have looked into his eyes. He is not like his father. He is searching for the truth, just like us. I have a feeling he is the last chance for the truth about your mother to come to light. Be strong, my daughter. Love, Dad. Lena was speechless. The letter trembled in her hands. She read it again and again, each word engraving itself on her mind. Trust him. He is the last chance. She had been wrong. She had screamed at the only person her father trusted. Guilt and regret washed over her, more painful than the loss itself. Just then, her phone vibrated. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello, is this Miss Lena Carter?" A man's voice on the other end sounded anxious. "My name is Mark. I used to be Victor Langford's assistant." Lena frowned. Victor Langford? "Yes, I was just fired. I can't stay silent any longer. I know who was behind your father's death. It wasn't Adrian Hale." Mark said it all in one breath. "I have proof. I have emails showing Victor ordered one of his contacts at the hospital to swap the pharmacist's shift. He slipped a false medication order into the system, deliberately causing your father's death to eliminate the last link to Green Haven and to frame Adrian Hale. He wanted to get rid of them both at the same time." Everything clicked into place. Victor's feigned sympathy, her father's warning, the perfectly aligned evidence against Adrian. It was a trap. Without a moment's hesitation, her grief transformed into strength. She clutched her father's letter and her phone. "Where are you?" she asked Mark. "Send me everything you have, right now." She didn't go to the police station. She knew a standard investigation would take too long, and Victor had enough power to interfere. She went straight to the Hale Capitol Tower and demanded to see the head of the legal department, the Hale family's personal lawyer. She placed her father's letter and the emails Mark had just sent on the desk. "Adrian Hale is innocent," she said, her voice steely and unwavering. "This is the proof. Now, do whatever it takes to get him out." The head of Hale Capital's legal department, a man more loyal to the Hale family than to the law, acted immediately upon seeing the irrefutable evidence Lena provided. But he knew that to go up against someone like Victor Langford, lawyers alone weren't enough. He took Lena and the entire file to the one person who could make the final decision: Marcus Hale. They met in the familiar study where Marcus had spoken his cruel words about compassion. This time, facing Lena, a small but resilient young woman armed with proof of a meticulously planned murder. His composure began to crack. "My son is being held for a crime that Victor committed," Marcus said, his voice low. He didn't look at Lena, but out the window, where the tower bearing his name stood tall. "Adrian is innocent," Lena said, her voice fearless. "But your silence about Green Haven gave Victor the opportunity to do this. You can continue to be silent to protect your empire, or you can tell the truth to save your son. It was a grim choice. Marcus Hale was facing the consequences of his past decisions, the fear that Victor, when cornered, would drag his entire family through the mud, the thought of his grandchildren who would have to grow up with a tarnished legacy, and perhaps flickering somewhere deep inside was the image of his son, who had tried to do the right thing, now paying the price. Finally, the old wolf was tired. Marcus picked up the phone, not calling his lawyers, but the city's chief of police. "This is Marcus Hale," he said, his voice weary but clear. "I want to turn myself in, for Greenhaven and for Victor Langford." With Marcus's confession and the evidence Lena provided, everything fell apart quickly. Adrian was exonerated and released immediately. Victor Langford was arrested for murder, manipulation, and a host of other financial crimes. The Hale empire was shaken to its core, but it didn't collapse. It was being cleansed by fire. The day Adrian was released, the first person he wanted to see was Lena. He found her at the cemetery, placing a bouquet of white chrysanthemums on her father's new grave, next to her mother's older one. He stood at a distance, not daring to approach. Lena sensed his presence and turned. There was no more hatred in her eyes, only a deep sorrow and a hint of shame. "I'm sorry," she said softly. I didn't believe you." "No," Adrian shook his head. "I'm the one who made it impossible for you to trust. I'm sorry. For everything." They stood in silence for a long time among the rows of tombstones. No words of forgiveness were spoken, because they both understood that some wounds could not be healed with words. A few months later, on a clear morning, on a plot of land on the outskirts of the city, the inauguration of the Carter Foundation was held. It was not a glamorous event. The guests were mostly families of victims of workplace accidents, students, and laborers. Adrian stood at the podium in a simple suit. He no longer had the cold, arrogant air of before. In front of the stage, a local elementary school choir was singing. "Today, we are not here to rebuild an empire," he said, his voice sincere and steady. "We are here to rebuild its conscience." The Carter Foundation was not established to erase sins, because sins can't be erased. It was established to honor the memory of people like Henry and Eleanor Carter, who lived and worked with dignity, and to ensure that no family ever has to endure a similar tragedy in silence again. He didn't go to Henry's grave to apologize with words. Instead, he used actions to atone. The foundation would support victims of workplace accidents and provide full scholarships to engineering students from disadvantaged backgrounds, so that talents like Lena would never have to give up on their dreams. In the audience, Lena stood, smiling faintly. Her smile wasn't entirely happy, but it was peaceful. On her finger, the silver ring remained. It was not given away, because it was hers, her parents' legacy, a symbol of her own journey. The sun shone down, making the silver ring gleam with a warm, enduring light, no less brilliant than a diamond. The object that was once mocked had become a testament to justice, resilience, and faith found in the ashes. And so, our story concludes, not with the dazzling light of a diamond, but with the warm glow of a silver ring. That ring, once an object of ridicule, ultimately became the most powerful symbol of all. It reminds us that true value lies not in appearance or price, but in the story it carries and its endurance through trials. The cheap metal that withstood a fire, gold, could not. Through Lena's journey, we see the power of quiet dignity. She didn't respond with hatred, but used truth to seek justice. Her strength was not loud, but it was unbreakable, and through Adrian, we learn a profound lesson about redemption. He realized that rebuilding a conscience is more important than rebuilding an empire. The most sincere apology is not spoken in words, but demonstrated through actions that create positive and lasting change in the lives of others. Perhaps this story is a reminder for all of us to look deeper than the surface, to cherish values that cannot be measured in money, and to believe that even in the ashes of loss, faith and kindness can still grow. In your own lives, perhaps you have silver rings as well, simple, old things, not sparkling, but holding a universe of memories and serving as your spiritual anchor when you fall. Are you taking care of your own ring? I hope the answer is yes. Thank you for following this story to the very end. I hope it has left a warm and thoughtful echo in your heart. See you in the next story.